Hey everybody, before we get going with this video, I just want to remind everybody about Chunky's GoFundMe page. I talked about this in my last video, and I'm going to talk about it again here just because we're getting close to his surgery. Chunky is a puppy that a friend of mine has been fostering for a while now, and he's found his forever home, which, yay, that's good news, but he needs some surgery to help with his breathing problems. So my friend set up a GoFundMe page for Chunky just so they can get the money for his surgery. And it's made a very good amount of money so far, and thank you all to those who have donated and have shared the links. Thank you all so much for that. But we just need to try to get a little closer to the goal just to make the payment process a little easier for people. So I've got a link to Chunky's GoFundMe page down below. If you can donate, great. If you can't, I completely understand. I understand, people need to pay rent and stuff like that, but if you could at least share the link, that would be great. Thank you all to those who have helped so far. Every little bit helps. Again, thank you for that. And yeah, let's just try to see if we can help this little guy out a little bit. But on that note, let's get on with the video. Oh my God! Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Art of the Scare. This is a series I do where I take a well-known horror movie and I look at the scariest scene from that movie, or at least one of the scariest scenes from that movie, and I attempt to analyze it and talk about why it works so well, or at least why I think it works so well. Typical disclaimer for this, I'm not a psychology expert. I know very little about psychology, and I am a movie fan, but I don't like calling myself a film expert. I'm just a guy who's enthusiastic about the horror genre, and I love talking about the horror genre. For the first episode of Art of the Scare, I talked about Kirk's death from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is my favorite scene in the entire horror genre. I love that scene so much. I think it's a perfectly constructed scene, perfectly executed scene. It is my favorite scene in horror. But the shotgun scene from Maniac is my second favorite scene in all of horror, and it's a very close second. Both Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Maniac are some of my favorite movies of all time, not just horror, and focusing on Maniac in particular, I think that this is a very underappreciated horror movie. It does have its loyal fan base. I am a member of that loyal fan base, but in terms of the slasher movies that come out and other horror movies that come out in the 80s, most people would not consider Maniac to be a classic. They might consider it a subcategory classic where it's like an underground classic, but not really a classic of the horror genre. I do regard it as a classic, obviously. I love this movie so much. It's pretty obvious how much I love this movie, but I think it deserves to be held in higher regards, and not just by those of us who defend it.
Getting very careless. Blood in your hair. What will people say?
So the plot is very simple. We're following the life of a serial killer, Frank Zito, played by Joe Spinell, in one of his best performances. I'd say it is his best performance. This is a man who goes around New York City killing women. He does kill men too, but they're mostly just in the way of his primary target, which is the women. Anyway, he kills these women and he takes their scalps. And he fills his apartment with mannequins, where he takes these scalps and puts them on the mannequins and basically talks to these mannequins in his apartment.
I won't ever let them take you away from me.
There are many great, disturbing, scary moments in Maniac. One of the things that I find so frightening is the fact that we're constantly hearing Frank have conversations with himself in his head.
This has got to stop. It's silly. And it's not getting us anywhere. You think they don't know? They do.
There's that great sequence where he's stalking a nurse, and it's such a frightening scene because we've all had those moments where we think somebody is following us, and at least hopefully it turns out that that's not the case, it's just us being paranoid. But this scene takes that idea and says, yeah, what if you are really being followed by somebody? But the scene that pops into everyone's head when talking about Maniac is the shotgun scene. This is one of the greatest head explosions in movies, one of the best examples of gore effects in movies, but it's not just the gore that makes this scene scary. It's the cherry on the top, but the whole scene is terrifying before we even get that explosion. Things get creepy in the scene that happens right before the shotgun scene, where we see Frank Zito packing up a violin case with his shotgun. Frank is taking this gun apart and packing it into the violin case, showing that he's very familiar with this weapon. And there's a little moment in this scene that I didn't notice before, and I am shocked that I did not notice this little moment here, because I've seen this movie so many times, and then there's just this one little detail that I did not pay much attention to, but it was brought to my attention by Mr. Parka on his channel. He talked about this in a video he did. Mr. Parka is one of my favorite YouTubers to watch. By all means, go check out his channel. It's great, and it's very underrated. But as he's packing up this shotgun, there's a box of Cracker Jacks near the violin case, and he's taking Cracker Jacks and eating them as he's packing up his gun. And one of the things I talk about, like I said, is that Maniac is visual with how it gets into the killer's mind. It's showing you what's going on in Frank Zito's head, but in a visual way. Him eating Cracker Jacks while packing up his shotgun shows that he has a childlike mindset. This childlike mindset in this grown man that lashes out in very violent ways.
Polly want a cracker?
Then we cut to the young couple who is eventually going to be the victim of Frank Zito. We have Tom Savini playing the guy in this relationship, and he is the one who did the effects work for this movie. And the reason he wanted to have the part of the boyfriend is because the boyfriend is the one who gets his head blown off by the shotgun, and because of the way they filmed this scene, they only had one chance to do it, and I'll get into that more in a little bit, but they only had one shot at getting this scene right, so he figured if he played the part, he would be able to make the right facial expression for the mold that he could make of himself before blowing the head off. And yes, he was the guy holding the shotgun, so in a way he blew his own head off. Anyway, you have this young couple, you have a man and a woman, they're leaving a nightclub or a bar or something, and they're driving off to go have some late night fun, and they're being followed by Frank Zito. So they park their car and they get into the back seat of that car and they start making out, they start feeling each other up. The foreplay has begun and they're getting ready for some backseat sex. But we know Frank Zito is in the area. It's obvious he's in the area. We see him get out of his car and start walking towards the car of these lovers. It's that lover's lane scenario. You know, you hear this in urban legends, you see this in 50s movies and plenty of movies after that as well. The lover's lane areas where all the teens go to make out and make whoopee, and it's usually off in the middle of the woods or at an overlook of the town. But the thing about the Lover's Lane situation is, again, it's usually in the woods, it's usually in a small town, it's usually off the beaten path. Whereas in here, it's taking place in a city. And that changes the dynamic a little bit, because people have this false sense of security that the dangerous stuff is farther away from civilization. The monsters and the maniacs are off in the middle of the woods. They're in the small towns. They're not in this civilized society of concrete and bricks. There is plenty of danger in cities, but people don't like to associate monsters with civilization. But there are plenty of monsters in civilization, and that's why cities are one of my favorite settings for horror movies, because it shows how close evil really is. And then we get to one of the scariest parts of this scene. This moment, I think, makes the shotgun blast scarier. You have this couple, they're in the back seat, they're making out, they're feeling each other up, they're getting ready to start having sex, and then we see Frank looking at them through the car window. Two things that make this moment so frightening. First of all, it's that he's so close. He's right outside of their car. In a lot of horror movies where the killer is watching the victims, they're usually at some kind of distance. They're either watching them through the windows of a house or a cabin, so they're close, but they're still somewhat far away, or they're watching them back from the bushes. They're hiding in the woods watching their victim. But here, Frank Zito is right outside of their car. They're making out in the passenger seat. So it's less, having a wall between the killer and the victims, or having some space between the killer and the victims. Frank Zito is closer to them than I am to my camera. There's not much space between the killer and the victims in this scenario. And the second thing is that he's watching them during a very intimate moment. They're having foreplay before they have sex. The whole thing about sex in horror movies is that, there is that whole thing of don't have sex in a slasher movie or you're going to die, but the main thing about sex in horror movies is that it's a very vulnerable state. The thought of somebody watching you in such an intimate, private moment is very unsettling. It's uncomfortable in a way. I mean, there's always that fear, people always have that fear of being watched during their private moments, whether it's getting undressed, taking a shower, or having sex, or at least building up to having sex. We never really like the thought of someone watching us in those intimate, private moments. And in Maniac, Frank Zito is just right there watching it. I mean, if the window were down, he could probably reach out and touch them in the process of this.
I see something.
It's your wife.
No, let's get out of here. Somebody out there. There's somebody over there.
So we've already had the tension building up in this scene, and now it's gotten even more frightening because of how close Frank Zito is to these people. And then we get the big moment. The couple climbs back into the front seat, the guy turns on the car, he turns on the headlights, and we see Frank Zito standing there with the shotgun. And again, we know he was close to the car, but it's not a jump scare moment. He doesn't turn on the light, we suddenly see Frank Zito pointing the shotgun, and then kapoof, with a loud musical sting. No, it's still set up perfectly. We see him with his shotgun, we see him far away, and then it turns to slow motion as he runs towards the car, he leaps onto the hood of the car, and that's when he pulls the trigger. It's that buildup of suspense before we get that bang. The fact that we see him far away and that we see him run towards the car is so much more effective than if he just blew the guy's head off. And then we have that added element of that close-up shot of the blood splattering onto his date's face. It's those little details that make the scene better. She did not just see her boyfriend get killed, she's also now covered with him. Now, the way they did this scene, and this has been talked about so many times on behind-the-scenes stuff, fan pages of Maniac, so this isn't much of a secret. Yes, it is a fake head of Tom Savini, and they filled it up with fake blood and leftovers from their lunch. You know, like apple cores and cheese whiz and stuff like that, to get that interesting effect of brains and gore spreading all over the car as the head was blown off. Nice little DIY elements, you know, these little tricks that they use, these little low-budget tricks that they used to make the gore scenes pop a little more. I like that. And yes, this was a real shotgun being used for this scene. And of course, this being an independent low-budget feature, they didn't have any permits for anything, so after they filmed this scene, after they blew the dummy's head off, they had to basically dump the car somewhere and run away. That's independent filmmaking at its finest. But the scene doesn't end with the head getting blown off, because now we have the girl in the car covered in her boyfriend's blood with Frank Zito holding a shotgun outside of the car. And of course you have Frank Zito moving around the car as she's screaming in terror, covered in blood, and I respect the fact that we do not see her die. It's made very clear that she is killed, but we don't need to see her death, because we just had this great gore scene of watching this guy's head get blown off. It wouldn't be as effective, you know, it's like we already had the big moment. You know, we've seen all we need to see. We know what happened to her. We know what a shotgun can do. We just saw it happened. So we don't need to see the girl getting killed. Gore can be effective, but the build-up to the gore can be equally as effective. The reason the shotgun scene works so well is because of the little moments building up to it. Because yes, you could just have the guy getting his head blown off, and that would have been a surprising moment. It would have made the audience go, whoa! But the fact that you have a proper build-up to that, the fact that you have the scene continue after that with the woman screaming in the car afterwards, it makes it go from whoa to holy shit. It makes the scene stand out even more, because as great as the gore is, you have good stuff all around the gore, and having good stuff around the gore makes the gore even better. Anyway, thank you all for joining me for this episode of Art of the Scare. I hope you enjoy listening to me ramble on about movies I love. And we'll put a question in here. What are your thoughts on Maniac? Do you like Maniac? Do you dislike Maniac? And what are some of your... What do you think are some of the most underappreciated horror movies out there? I really want to know here. And of course, I would love to do more episodes of Art of the Scare, so if there are any movies you would like me to cover in the future, leave them in the comments down below. But on that note, yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for the continued support on my channel. If you can, please check out Chunky's GoFundMe page. I'll link that in the comments section below. But until next time, this is the Maniac here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.